Hello and welcome friends. In Indian economy, we have been studying industrial policy, that is unit number 5. We talked about the basics of industrial policy and then we moved over to the discussion on industrial policy 1956, wherein we talked about the provisions with respect to the private sector as well as the public sector enterprises. We also talked about the various other features of the industrial policy of 1956. We then started talking about the industrial policy of 1991 and understood what we mean by LPG, liberalization, privatization and globalization. In the last sessions that we had, we talked about industrial policies, provisions with respect to public sector. In that sense, we have basically talked about the privatization aspect. We also talked about the delicensing provisions of industrial policy, wherein now, after the implementation of 91 industrial policy, only 18 sectors required some licenses to operate. Otherwise, all other sectors, there was absolutely no requirement of obtaining license to start a business unit. So that was the provision of industrial policy of 1991, and in a way this basically corresponds to the liberalization aspect of the LPG, because there was no requirement of obtaining permits or licenses from the government now. So in a way there was the end of the Inspector Raj era or the Permit Raj era or the License Raj era, and that is why this particular aspect can be connected to the liberalization aspect. Now we have to discuss today the trade liberalization, wherein we are going to talk about how it was made easier for Indians to import goods, services as well as to export them. So this in a way is the globalization aspect of the LPG of 1991. Now, as far as the provisions were concerned, let us discuss them one by one. First was that the trade liberalization was effected by replacing the import licenses by Exim Scripts. So earlier, the importers needed to obtain license from the government to import some items. Now this system was done away with and this system was replaced by Exim Scripts. Now Exim Scripts, what do we mean by this? X stands for export and IM stands for import. Export linked import entitlements. So basically, how much you can import would be dependent on how much you are exporting. So a particular percentage of how much you are exporting, you can also import. So this is what we mean by export linked import entitlements. The entitlement, the authority given you to import depending on how much you are exporting. Just to give you a rough example, supposing I am exporting goods worth ₹100, right? It could so happen that the Exim Scripts would mention that 50% of this amount, which is around ₹50, I can also import goods worth ₹50. Fine. For example, if somebody else is exporting ₹200, so for him the provision would be the same. He can import 50% of this value and he would now be eligible to import ₹100 worth of goods. So this is what we mean by Exim Scripts. The whole idea behind this was to preserve our forex reserve, because naturally the export would be more than the imports. So this was the basic idea behind this particular provision, and it was also ensured that this provision does not hinder exports from the country or imports into the country. Liberalization import authorization replaced canalization. What do we mean by this? Now what is canalization? Canalization is, I hope you know what a canal is, neher. So just like canal is used to carry the river water to a particular destination, the water passes through the canal and it cannot take any other route. Just like that, earlier, if some imports had to be done, a few selected entities were given the import authorizations. Only few selected items could import those items. Now this was what was referred to as canalization. Only these particular selected importing entities could have imported items. But now this system was again replaced and now import licenses were available for everybody. Import authorization regime was liberalized. What do we mean by this? Now anybody could have asked the government for authority to bring in imports. Earlier that system never existed. Earlier only a few entities were allowed the authority to import items. Now this authority was given away to whosoever wanted that, whosoever requested for that authority. So in that sense, our import channels also broadened, were liberalized. So many importers came into play and they started importing various items. So in that sense, the Industrial Policy 1991 made it easier for the Indian economy to import various items, and that is why we call it trade liberalization. And by trade we mean the foreign trade liberalization. Now, ceilings on import of capital goods was also raised. Ceilings, the maximum amount of money that you can spend on importing capital items. Now this maximum amount was increased further so that more of capital goods can be imported. Now why was this done? Because you understand that capital goods are different from consumer goods. I hope you understand and remember what you had discussed in marketing management. Capital goods are those items which are used for some commercial purpose. So they are called capital goods. So they are used by some entity for some commercial purpose, not for direct consumption. On the other hand, consumer goods are those goods which are used by the end customer for consumption. Let me give you an example. Supposing you are buying a generator, small generator for your household, or let's say small inverter for your household, that would be considered to be a consumer good. Why? Because the end customer, you are the end customer, you are buying it for yourself, and you would not be buying in bulk. You would probably only be buying one inverter or one generator, and the capacity would also be somewhere around 1 kilowatt, right? On the other hand, if the same generator is being bought by a college like ours or maybe a bank branch, don't you think they would be buying a generator of much higher capacity? They would probably be buying a generator of maybe 5 kilowatt or 10 kilowatt, right? Now the generator which has been brought by the bank or the college is an example of capital goods. On the other hand, those bought by retail customers like us is an example of consumer good. Fine. While the consumer goods are being used for own consumption, capital goods are generally used for some commercial purpose. So the bank or the college would run its services. Whenever there is no electricity, they would use these inverters to run their services. Fine. So that is why import of capital goods is considered to be far more preferable than import of consumer goods. Fine. And that was why government raised the ceilings, raised the maximum amount that could be spent on import of capital goods. Majority foreign ownership in trading firms. Trading firms were those which engage in export allowed. Now, if there is a trading firm, it could have a majority ownership by some foreign entity. Earlier, this provision was not there. Majority ownership used to be with the Indian entity. Now, this particular provision was also relaxed, and in that sense, it became easier for the foreign capital to reach Indian shores. For the foreign capital, I'm talking about the financing, the foreign financing to come to India. So there were so many trading firms which were set up with foreign majority ownership after this particular provision was brought in. Automatic approval to foreign technology agreements in high priority sectors. What do we mean by foreign technology agreements? You know that India traditionally has not been a very developed country vis-a-vis the quality of the technology developed or vis-a-vis new breakthroughs in the technology, new innovations. So naturally, many a times we had to rely on some foreign entity to get the best of the technology, to get the latest of the technology, the most cutting edge technology. So we were forced to actually buy it from them, right? Now this particular system was further relaxed. This particular system was made much more liberal now, and now in case such foreign technology is being bought by some firm here in India, there was no need to go for approval to the government or to the RBI. Now there was automatic approval given for this, which means if you as a business entity are buying some foreign technology, you will not have to go to the government for approval. The automatic approval means the approval would be deemed to have been granted. So in that sense, bureaucratic red tape was reduced. Hiring foreign technicians and testing facilities. As you know that in India, as I said already, India was traditionally, after independence I'm talking about, was not traditionally a society full of innovations or cutting edge technological breakthroughs. So we had to depend on foreign technicians, foreign experts, foreign technocrats, technologists, and we used to hire them. The entities here in India, the business firms here in India used to hire these entities from outside. So now this particular system was also further liberalized. Not only this, now Indian firms could have gone to some foreign company, they could have collaborated with foreign company for testing their products. What do we mean by testing here? We are basically talking about the quality testing aspect, right? So they could have now contacted some foreign testing platform to test their products and services. Now this was also allowed in the 1991 industrial policy. Higher royalty payments for foreign technology. Naturally, if you are buying technology from outside, you will have to pay royalty. Otherwise, why would somebody give away his or her proprietary technology to you, the technology that he or she has developed? So you will have to pay something back to that particular entity, and that particular payment is known as royalty. You must have read about this while talking about the World Trade Organization and intellectual property rights. So you have to pay royalties. Now, again, the ceiling on such royalty payments was also done away with. You did not need to, higher ceilings were done away with. You did not need to restrict your royalty payments to foreign technology providers. You could have paid much more amount to foreign providers of technology for their technology, right? So higher royalty payments were now allowed. Earlier, there was this inhibition against these kind of payments to foreign entities. The reason was that the government wanted to preserve its forex reserve. Now let us talk about some more features of industrial policy of 1991. What are the other features? What were the other features? Foreign investment, vis-a-vis foreign investment, up to 51% permitted in high priority industries. Now, if the high priority industries, some of the industries which were very crucial, vital for the economy of the country, which were crucial for the economic development, economic well-being of the country, up to 51% of foreign equity participation was allowed. So, majority foreign ownership was allowed in such industries. But the condition was that the foreign equity, the money which is being provided by the foreign owner, against which he has been allocated more than 50% of shares. Now, that money should have covered the forex requirement for capital goods import, foreign exchange requirement for importing capital goods. So let me give an example. Supposing a company here in India is worth rupees 100, just to give you a hypothetical example, and let's say it needed 40 rupees to buy some capital goods from outside, from some foreign country. So it needed 30 rupees. Now in this case, up to 51%, which means 51 rupees out of the 100 rupees which this particular company is worth, could have been invested by the foreign player, because the money that is investing would cover up the foreign equity, rupees 30 required to buy the foreign capital goods, foreign made capital goods. So now this was also allowed, provided that the foreign equity thus provided by the foreign partner covers the requirement of foreign exchange that you had for importing the capital goods. Not only this, dividend payments to foreign shareholders was also allowed. Now what do we mean by dividend payment? When you buy ownership in a particular firm, it may so happen that that particular firm earns a lot of profit and they decide to distribute part of the profit or full profit among the shareholders. So as a shareholder, what you get because you are owning a particular share is known as the dividend. You might have read about this in financial management. Fine. Now earlier there was a restriction on how much dividend could be paid to some foreign shareholder. For example, if there is a company here in India and let's say 20% of the shares are owned by some foreign firm, so how much of the dividend could be paid to them? There were some restrictions. Now these restrictions were lifted and dividend payment could have been made to such foreign owners of shares, foreign shareholders also. So in that sense, it became easier for the Indian firms to attract the foreign shareholders to invest their money in them. So this was how the obstacles which were there between India and other countries, foreign countries, the obstacles which were raised to prevent import or export of goods into the country or goods outside of the country, those restrictions were lifted or at least relaxed significantly. And that is why this particular aspect is known as globalization, because this helped the Indian economy integrate more closely to the global economy. Automatic approval. Now this happened in 1996, as I told earlier also in the last session, that in 1996, for example, licensing requirements was removed for automobile sector, cars also. Likewise, in 1996, automatic approval for foreign equity participation in 16 industries. 16 industries were specified in which, if there is a foreign equity participation, it was deemed to have been approved. There was no need for obtaining permission from the government. It was deemed to have been given automatic approval. There is no need to apply for approval. So if an entity here in India, operating in these 16 sectors, if that particular entity wants 51% of foreign ownership of the shares or 51% of the investment coming from foreign firms or foreign entities, then this was given automatic approval. They didn't have to go and seek the approval. Now another important aspect, I hope you remember what you have been discussing in business environment, Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act. Now this was brought about towards the end of 1960s, somewhere around 1968-69. The whole idea was to ensure that the large-scale industries do not become so very dominant. They don't gain monopoly power in the market. So that was the whole idea behind Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act. I hope you also know that in 2002 this has now been replaced by Competition Act, and MrTP Act does not remain on the statute books, remain on the law books anymore. So in 1991 there were some provisions of the MrTP Act which were relaxed to waive off need for prior approval, which means now no prior approval was required if some entity wanted to float a new business unit, if they wanted to start a new business unit, or if they wanted to expand capacity in the existing units. So they might want to double the capacity. So if they are producing 100 bikes in a particular month, they might want to double the capacity to, let's say, 200. Again, if two entities wanted to come together, merge their operations, for that also no permission was required after 1991. Appointment of directors was also not subject to permission by the government. So there was no need for such large-scale enterprises on which MrTP Act was applicable. There was no need for them to seek approval if they wanted to start a new business unit, or if they wanted to expand their existing business unit, or if they wanted to merge their operations with some other place in the market, or if they wanted to appoint directors. The whole idea was to ensure that the large-scale enterprises do not become too entrenched, too dominant, too powerful as far as the Indian economy is concerned, because that would have been counterproductive for the smaller firms, MSME sector, micro, small, medium enterprises. So that was why these provisions were brought about in the MrTP Act, but they were all done away with in 1991 industrial policy. Fine. So thank you very much for your time. We are going to have another discussion on industrial policy of 1991, wherein we'll be discussing the failures, the shortcomings of the policy of 1991. Thank you very much for your time.